Your Bible's up to Galatians chapter 5. Galatians 5 will be our first passage. You'll remember, especially being those of you from Alabama, and I guess most of us are, there may be some visitors here, but you'll remember several years ago, within the last decade or so, when all the big hullabaloo started with the Ten Commandments and having them at courthouses and all the lawsuits and all the things that took place over that. It kind of consumed the state for a little bit, consumed state politics for a little bit. It kind of just a quick show of just maybe how little people understand about the Old Testament's role, what it plays, and people got so upset about that, not having any idea and unaware of its place in Scripture. And then we leave that thing that happened here, and you look throughout the world, throughout religious beliefs, and you see that many still trying to bind, if not all, at least certain parts of the Old Testament. It comes out in a lot of ways. It comes out sometimes very, very small, but David used instruments as if that binds anything or authorizes anything today. You have the idea of tithing. People still have that concept in their mind, whereas the New Testament talks about free will offering of a purpose, and not just a purpose, but purpose as prospered. There's still in many places the distinction made between clergy and laity. You know, there's the so-called priesthood, and then, bless their heart, everybody else. And there's a lot of distinctions made, a lot of problems with it. But you remember in Galatians chapter 5, Paul trying to deal with that as the Judaizers went doing their thing. And he said, if you're going to go back to and be justified by it, well, here's what that means in verse 3. Galatians 5, verse 3, I testify to every man that's circumcised. That circumcision there, not just circumcision, but for those trying to justify themselves. That's how I am righteous. For everyone that is circumcised, verse 3, he's a debtor to do the whole law. So the consequence of that is, first of all, it obligates us to all of it. And make sure, even in your mind, underline that word do. It doesn't obligate us to try to do it. No, if you're going to be justified by the law, you've got to do the whole law. And we know how impossible that was, except for Christ himself. But that's a consequence of this. Pick back up in verse 4. Christ, the old King James says, has become no effect to you. Newer translations use, you have alienated yourself from him. You are separated from him. Some of them even use the word, kind of a play on what circumcision is. You have severed yourself from Christ. Now think about what a literal physical circumcision is. A severing of some skin that is then discarded. He says that's what you've done to deity. You have separated yourself from God, from Christ. That's a big consequence. Look at the last phrase in verse 4. And whosoever you are, being trying to justify yourself by the law, you have fallen from grace. That's the consequences of trying to bind as justification the old law. It obligates us to all of it. You can't pick and choose. It's not the smorgasbord. It's not just we're going to Ryan's and picking out little bitty things that we like and discard the rest. No, if you're going to keep this as justification, then you got to keep it all. We're obligated to do all of it. That's the first consequence. The second is it separates us from Christ. It severs us from him. And then thirdly, just in case we didn't get the point, you have fallen from grace. And without grace, you and I have no hope. There is no salvation outside of grace. That's the consequences, and they are serious. Well, so what happens is, as what happens a lot of times, one extreme becomes the other. You had this rubber band effect where we just leapfrog to a far opposite side. And I'm thankful I don't know many people like this. I have heard it said a time or two, and I'm guessing many of you have as well. The opposite danger is that we have some who will then admit, yes, that's right, the old law's done away with, nailed to the cross, which is exactly right. And then just completely discard it, completely. See no value in it at all. And so with these opposite extremes, one, elevating the old law to a place it doesn't need to be. The other, not even recognizing that it has a place. Well, both are wrong. One is wrong as the other. And Romans chapter 15 is where we're going to base our study. Turn to Romans 15. And let's just make sure that we remind ourselves that all of the revelation, all of the revealed word has a purpose. And I know this is nothing new. We're just going to kind of, every month or so, not all the time, but about once a month or so, and hopefully these first lessons, these first meetings that we have, going to try to start working our way through some, I guess what you might call some first principle lessons, just to reground us, to recommit ourselves to some very basic elementary principles. And we're going to start with that today, just by reminding ourselves the role of the Old Testament, how to properly use it, because it does have a purpose. It is to be used. Romans 15, verse 4. Whatever things that were written aforetime, speaking of those earlier scriptures, they were written for our learning, that we through patience, that word means endurance, and through comfort, that one is encouragement, the scriptures will give us hope. They were written, verse 4, for our learning. There is something to be learned. There is a purpose. And by learning those things, it will help us as we endure and persevere, and it will help us through discouraging moments. Discouraging times. Patience and comfort. Endurance and encouragement. All of that under the idea, the umbrella of our learning, our understanding. And it's, even the very text itself, if you back up into verse 3, he had just got through quoting the Old Testament. That's kind of interesting. In the very text where he speaks of the purpose of the Old Testament, he had just quoted one to show how it applied. So they were written for us. They were written for them. And there is something to be learned. So what I want us to do, as a first principle, the way we can know we're doing it right, using the Old Testament properly, and there's the key word, using it properly. How can we know, beyond a doubt, that we're using it in a proper manner? Well, how about we use it in the same way that the epistles used it? How about we use the Old Testament in our teaching, in our existence, the same way the inspired men and prophets used them? If we can do it like they did it, we'll know we're doing it right. So how is it? How did New Testament writers, I'm not talking about us, how did New Testament writers use the Old Testament following Pentecost? Well, let's look and see. The first thing they did was they used it as character studies. Hebrews 11, we won't turn to these verses, but they used it as character studies. Hebrews 11, by faith, Abel. By faith, Noah. By faith, Abraham. By faith, Sarah. By faith, Moses. And on it went. In Jude 11, we find out that all the character studies that we see, they weren't always really good characters. In Jude 11, you've got Cain, and we know what he did. You have Balaam, the one who prophesied for money, who schemed and planned until he found a way so he could get paid. It speaks of Korah, the rebellion of Korah. A couple weeks ago or so, we talked about when Abraham's sister, Miriam, and Aaron, the brother, when they kind of attacked Moses a little bit, claimed he was taking on too much and that they were just as qualified, etc. There were worse things than that people did. Korah started a rebellion against him. They would have killed him if they could have got their hands on him that day. And so we have New Testament writers through inspiration showing us both the good and the bad, positives and negatives. Here's a couple of examples. James chapter 5, take my brethren, the prophets. So here's James talking about Old Testament prophets who have spoken in the name of the Lord for an example of suffering and enduring. Anybody here suffering? Anybody in here having to endure pains of the flesh? Larry just mentioned the aged, and etc., and the hospitalizations and the surgeries and the upcoming tests. Anybody here suffering? Because there are people, New Testament writers wanted us to remember. The prophets endured and they suffered. In James 5, he goes on, you've heard of the patience of Job. You know how that can be a true statement? Take the Old Testament out. And you know what? James is no longer correct. Because we have no longer heard of the endurance of Job. We wouldn't have a clue of what that was talking about. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus speaking, and he talks of making, I guess what we would call comparing and contrasting. Don't forget the men of Nineveh. They heard the preaching of Jonah, and they repented. There is some better preaching going on now, and if you don't listen to it, they're going to judge you. He goes on to talk, don't forget about the Queen of Sheba. She traveled a long way to show respect and honor to a glorious, wise king. Speaking of Solomon. And what Jesus' point is, there's a greater king among you today. And if you don't show glory and honor to him, her actions will judge you. Now think a second. Neither of these, we couldn't compare. We couldn't make that comparison and contrasting if we don't know what happened in Nineveh. If we don't know who the Queen of Sheba was, if we don't know who Solomon was. These character studies, good and bad, we don't have them. And the New Testament is full of using those examples. Trusting, expecting that we know what's being referred to. And the beauty of it is, if we're reading the New Testament and we read about this name, maybe it's an obscure name, maybe it's an obscure place, we can go back to the Old Testament and find it, and it's not obscure anymore. We know who they are. We can find out when they lived. We can find out whether Hebrews 11, the positive, or Jude 11, the negative. There is something to be learned. They were written for our learning. That's how the New Testament writers used them. They used them as character studies. If we're doing that, we know we can do it. We know we're doing it correctly. But what about events? Turn to 2 Corinthians 10. Sometimes it wasn't the people. It wasn't the character. It was just events, things that happened. New Testament inspired writers taking Old Testament events and saying there is something for you to get out of this. There is something for you to learn from this. 1 Corinthians 10, excuse me. 1 Corinthians 10. Start with me in verse 1. We won't read this whole text, but we'll read enough that we get the gist. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I would not that you be ignorant. Romans 15, they were written for our learning. What if we never learned from them? Is it too blunt to say we could be ignorant of that? Seems to be that's what Paul is saying could be possible. I don't want you to be ignorant of it, he said. I do not want you to be ignorant how that all our fathers that were under the cloud and that passed through the sea. Who's he talking about? He's talking about those who came out of Egypt. Passing under the cloud. Remember how they traveled. In the day, they followed the cloud. At night, they followed that fire, that billowing fire in the sky. They knew where to go. They were being led. Passing through the sea, that sounds exactly like what you think it sounds like. That's talking about how they got out of Egypt into the wilderness, into the peninsula. Our fathers who traveled under the cloud, who passed through the sea, I don't want you to be ignorant of them, he said. But what's he want them to know? Drop down to verse 5. We're not going to read the whole section. But here's what he's using their example. He's using that event, that time period. Verse 5. I don't want you to be ignorant of this. Of what? Many of them, God was not well pleased. They were overthrown in the wilderness. I don't want you to forget that these were God's people. They were his chosen on all the earth. God looked down, all the nations on the earth. I choose you, Israel. You are my people. I will be a God to you. You will be a nation to me. But those people didn't please him. Why didn't they please him? What happened? Verse 6. These things are our examples, that to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they lusted. Verse 7. Neither be idolaters, as were some of them. Verse 8. Neither commit fornication, as some of them. Verse 9. Neither let us tempt Christ, the Lord, as some of them. Verse 10. Neither murmur you, as some of them. Do we get the point? I don't want you to be ignorant. Verse 1. They are our example. Verse 4. An example in what? An example in what happens when we don't please the Lord. An example when we let uncontrolled sin reign. When we let lust. Lust has controlled a lot of people. There's been times in our life when it controlled us. The consequences were they failed. We're going to see as we keep reading, drop down into verse 11. All these things happen to them by way of example. They are written for our instruction. That's how the New Testament uses the Old. Character studies and events. Events used as examples. Here's what they did. Here's how God responded. So how about not doing it that way? That's, to paraphrase, that's what Paul is saying. They let lust control themselves, and you're letting it too. Well, here's where it leads you. They let idolatry control them, and so does the city of Corinth. And here's where it leads. And on he goes. And now, real quick lesson for us, verse 12. Therefore, he that thinks he stands, take heed lest he fall. He's used it as an example. These people fell. Here's why they fell. They are an example to us because the mighty fall all the time. And so if there are any Christians in Corinth, well, that's not me. Oh, it might be you. And he's waking them up to that. Oh, you're God's people now. The church is God. Well, let me tell you about some other people of his in times past. And here's where they ended up. And here's why they ended up there. Look in 2 Peter chapter 2 to encourage us a moment. That was 1 Corinthians is written as a warning. Here's the opposite of that. Here's a New Testament writer using Old Testament events not as a warning, but as an encouragement. So let's let it encourage us. In 2 Peter 2, just start with me in verse 5. So God did not spare the old world. He's talking about the flood. And we know what happened with the flood, the total destruction of it. God did not spare the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness. Drop down to verse 6. Sodom and Gomorrah. We know what happened there. God didn't spare those cities either. But, verse 7, he delivered just Lot. Earth destroyed by flood. But God knew who was righteous and he knew who to be protected. He destroyed wicked cities, but God knew who was righteous. He knew who was sickened by the things going on there. What's the conclusion, verse 9? The Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation. He knows how to deliver the godly and reserve them in the day of judgment from punishment. How exciting is that? And we wouldn't have a clue what was being spoken of if we just discard the Old Testament. The point is, for those, even Christians, sadly, that have made the statement, we don't need the Old Testament, that's done away with, we don't use. Take out the Old Testament, there's a lot of the New that doesn't make a lick of sense. And we just read two pretty big texts that would lose its power. We don't have any idea what Paul's telling the Corinthians. We don't have any idea of these events that Peter is encouraging Christians with. We lose the encouragement if we don't know about Noah. We lose the encouragement if we don't know about Lot. We couldn't fully appreciate the promise that God knows how to deliver faithful people even through trying times. Because there's trying times going on among us, and we need to be encouraged that God knows who His people are. The Old Testament does that for us by events and by examples. Look in Acts chapter 1. Through the fulfilling of prophecy. This is something just for my own personal, just open my own self up a little bit. That's something I want to be better at. Just, it's amazing. I'm just trusting others. Their research and their counting. It is incredible to even think how many Old Testament prophecies are fulfilled in the New. It's something I just on my own personal time want to be better at and maybe pay a little bit more attention to. But just as a way of real quick exercise, because we can do it in about 30 seconds, look in Acts chapter 1. Acts chapter 1. They've been sent back. Jesus has ascended to heaven. He's been told that he has sent the disciples back to Jerusalem, talking to the apostles, specifically the 11. It won't be very long, and what I told you is going to happen. Go to Jerusalem and wait. So while they are waiting there, verse 20, Peter reminds them of the Psalms. It is written in the Psalms, let his habitation be desolate. Let no man dwell therein. His office let another take. He said, hang on a second, guys. Judas is gone. There's not 12 of us anymore. There are 11. Do you remember what the Psalm said? There was going to be an office open, and it must be filled. He's reminding them of a prophecy that has to be fulfilled. Turn to page, chapter 2. The Holy Spirit descends in cloven fires and this cloven-looking tongue thing, whatever that meant. And then the apostles begin to speak in tongues. And for the first time under the history of the universe, the gospel of Christ is preached. And people began to question, how are they doing this? You know, those aren't trained men, and they're speaking. How do they know how to do all this? In chapter 2, verse 16, this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. Do you remember when Joel talked about the moon turning to this and people doing this and old men, young maidens, old maidens, rich, poor? You remember when Joel talked about that? 3 words. This is that. What you're seeing and hearing right now is what Joel was talking about. It's fulfilled prophecy. Turn the page, chapter 3. They have healed the lame man, and now they've basically been arrested about that. They're being challenged about that. And as that sermon was developed after the miracle, in verse 24, chapter 3, 24, all the prophets from Samuel and those that followed afterward, as many as spoke, they foretold of these days. All those prophecies working their way to this. Look in chapter 4. After the arrest happened, they're being challenged about their teaching. This, verse 11, this is the stone which was set at nothing by the builders that became the chief cornerstone. They've been talking about Jesus. Why are you preaching in His name? What? This is that. He is that. The Scriptures prophesied about a perfect square stone that would be picked up and examined and looked at and then thrown away. Not even recognized for what it was. The chief cornerstone that everything was going to be built off of wasn't even accepted. This is that. And you can keep on going. And so just for maybe that might be something you'd be interested in. Just start paying attention throughout all the epistles of how many reference back to Old Testament prophecies. It's an incredible faith-building exercise. All 4 Gospels quote prophets. There's not a one of them that doesn't. If that's how New Testament writers used it. They did character studies. They used events. They used prophecies that was being fulfilled right in front of their eyes. We talked this past Wednesday night about the types and the shadows. Go back to Colossians 2. We just studied this. It's actually the breaking point. It's where we will pick back up, hopefully this coming Wednesday night. But speaking of those Judaizers who were binding circumcision in verse 11, and who in verse 16 was binding feast days and holidays and all the other things. In verse 17, Paul said, they were just shadow. They were a shadow of things to come. They were not the real. They were not the body. They were not the substance. And it's not the shadow that gets the glory. It's whatever is casting the shadow. That's the real thing. He said they were all shadows. Now let's talk about what exactly does that mean? What can we put into that statement that makes some sense? Adam. And then New Testament writers talk about the new Adam. Think about Melchizedek, which the old scriptures tell us of, the Old Testament tells us. Then we have the Hebrew writer giving us the new Melchizedek, one who was both priest and king, one who had no successor, no predecessor, one just a shadow of the other. Think about Moses. We honor Moses, and rightfully so. He was the lawgiver. He was a deliverer from bondage. But the Hebrew writer emphasizing very clearly, there is a better lawgiver than him, and there is a better deliverer than him. One delivered out of physical slavery, one delivers from sin, one a shadow of the other. Think about David and the throne he sat on and the united kingdom that he ruled, and yet Christ today reigning. David was a shadow. Think about the tabernacle and the temple, specifically the most holy place. What was that? What was the most holy place to Jews? It was the dwelling place of God. That's what the ark's at. That's where God allowed them to imagine his presence to be among the people. But that was a shadow. The tabernacle, just an earthly, and the temple, well, earthly things built with earthly hands, and yet there is a genuine, true dwelling place of God where deity reigns and dwells in heaven. There's the real. And all that other stuff was just a shadow to help the people. And we can go on and on. The whole book of Hebrews, take the Old Testament away, we wouldn't understand maybe a quarter of it. Maybe that's giving us too much credit. We might not understood that much of it. It has a role. It has a specific role. We need to be appreciative of that. But one quick word of warning. When these types and shadows, and if we want to use a present day word, symbols, let's make sure that we're careful how we use them. Let's don't let our imagination run wild. It's a good idea to limit the types and the shadows to types that we just mentioned, where Scripture themselves outline it for us. A lot of people have gotten into a lot of trouble by trying to force something. Oh, this could represent that, which makes that okay. No, let's not try to cram things into our mindsets. There's enough types and shadows given and explained. Let's be content with that. And let's make sure we learn from that. I'm going to give you one more. All the wisdom. You've got the Psalms teaching us how to pray. You've got the Proverbs teaching us how to live. You've got Ecclesiastes teaching us how to judge between things under the sun that's just going to disappear and wear out and be stolen and be broken and just get outdated, versus those things that are eternal. It's teaching from start to finish about the things that are vain and empty and the things that really matter. The wisdom literature, just ways and whys of the world, helping us in our struggle to find happiness and to find the meaning of life. 3,000 years old, and there's not a thing me and you will experience under the sun where they don't apply. 3,000-year-old wisdom, and it fits as well as it ever has. This is how New Testament writers use the Old Testament. If we do this, we'll know we're right. And we'll know that we're getting from it what we ought to get from it. It's not just a bunch of kid stories. Let's appreciate it. It's sacred writings, and within them is wisdom that aids us and helps us through multiple ways as we work our way towards salvation. First principles. Once a month or so, we're just going to start hitting on some. Here's one. Maybe it hadn't been thought of or mentioned in a while, but we're not bound by the old law. We're not going to be judged by the old law. Make sure we understand that it was nailed to the cross. But let's make sure we appreciate it. It was written for our understanding, so let's make sure we understand. It was written for our learning, so let's make sure we learn. It was written for our encouragement, so let's let it encourage us. It was written for our admonishment, so let it teach us what it needs to teach. Get your songbooks out. Wonderful things about first principles. For some, it's a first go. First time to maybe hear some. For others, it just encourages us and builds us and reminds us of some things that maybe we know but have forgotten. Now that we've been reminded, let's not forget again. Let's appreciate and let's take what we can from it. Acts chapter 3. From Samuel on, he said the prophets were really talking about this. Talking about the one to come. Talking about the one who would truly bring with him salvation and save the people from their sins. Let's appreciate that. If you're not a Christian, take advantage of that. All the prophets talked about it. Then it became reality. And then all of the apostles spent the rest of their life doing what they could to spread it. And the Holy Spirit, through His work, we still have it all these years later. Let the work of those prophets value us. Let us take advantage of that. Those of us that are Christians, Old Testament, New Testament, irregardless, we're not letting the Scriptures teach us. We're not letting it direct our steps. It's called repenting. Let's humble ourselves and do it. And if we can do it, if we can help you in any way before we break off into our classes, do it while we sing this song.